Sweat trickled down the back of Elias's neck, even before the sun had fully risen over Capernaum. The uneven cobblestones burned through his worn sandals as he crossed the still empty marketplace, carrying a sack of grain that smelled of wheat and accumulated dust. The morning air carried that deceptive coolness of Galilee, which in a few hours would transform into the suffocating heat that made dogs seek shade and men avoid the midday sun. He knew every stone on that path. 7 years serving in the household of Centurion Lucius Servius had etched that route into the memory of his feet. The Roman house was located in the elevated part of the city, far enough from the synagogue not to offend the religious leaders, close enough to the barracks to maintain visible authority. Elias took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of rejection tighten around his chest like a wet bandage. The baker was already lighting the oven when Elias passed by. The smell of burning wood mingled with the sweet aroma of the first batch. But the man, who had once been a childhood friend, turned his face away. He said nothing. He never did. Just that dry movement of his neck, as if avoiding looking at something impure. Elias pressed the sack of grain against his chest and continued on his way. There was no point in feeling anger. The anger had dried up inside him long ago, like a well in summer. Inside the Roman house, the day began with the military efficiency that Lucius Servius demanded of everyone and everything. The white columns reflected the morning light, and the mosaic floor was always clean, always polished. Elias distributed the grains in the pantry, checked the jars of olive oil, counted the amphorae of wine. His fingers moved automatically, but his mind wandered to the same place as always, the last time he saw his father. It had been at the market 3 years ago. The old carpenter had looked at him with those eyes that once shone with pride, now hard as flint. "You chose their money," he had said, his voice low and sharp. "So let them be your family now." Elias swallowed hard, pushing the memory away. The hole in his chest never fully closed. The centurion descended the stairs around 3 in the morning. Lucius Servius was not like the other Roman officers. He didn't drink until he passed out. He didn't beat servants for pleasure. He didn't laugh when his soldiers humiliated Jews in the streets. There was something different about him, a quiet dignity that puzzled Elias, a Gentile invader who treated a Jewish servant with more respect than his own people. "Elijah," the centurion called, and there was tension in his voice. "Come." Elias followed him to the back rooms of the house, where the light filtered through linen curtains. There on a mat lay Marcos. The young servant who cared for the horses, the boy who always had a joke ready, was now as still as a stone. His skin had acquired a waxy pallor, and his breathing came in frighteningly long intervals. Sweat soaked his dark hair, and his forehead burned with fever. "Since last night," murmured the centurion, kneeling beside the boy. There was something in the man's posture that tightened Elias's chest even more. Lucius Servius, who commanded 100 soldiers, who represented the power of Rome, was there on his knees, his large calloused hand holding the servant's cold hand. "The doctors have already come. They say there's nothing to be done, that it's a matter of hours." Elias felt the ground give way beneath his feet. Mark was 17 years old. He was an orphan, like so many in Galilee after years of conflict and heavy taxation. The centurion had taken him in when no one else wanted him. And now, "Lord," Elijah heard his own voice coming out hoarse, "I am deeply sorry." The centurion rose slowly, and Elias saw something he never expected to see in the eyes of a Roman soldier. Tears not shed, held back only by iron discipline. "He is like a son to me," said Lucius, his voice breaking slightly. "I brought doctors from Caesarea. I offered sacrifices to the gods, but nothing works." Elijah remained silent. What could a rejected servant say to a Roman centurion about the loss? His own wounds still bled in silence. It was then that they heard the voices in the street. The noise began softly, like the murmur of a distant stream, but it grew louder. Voices building up, bare feet hitting the stone, the dragging of sandals, exclamations of astonishment. Elias walked to the window and looked out. A crowd moved down the main street like a human river. Hundreds of people, perhaps more. Fishermen casting their nets, merchants closing their stalls, women carrying children in their arms. All heading in the same direction, all with that expression Elias had seen before. Hope mixed with fear, curiosity tempered with despair. "What's going on?" The centurion approached the window. Elias listened to the fragments of conversations rising from the street. They say he healed a leper. Simon's mother-in-law was on the verge of her final journey, and now, I've never seen anything like it. The Nazarene. The Nazarene. Elias felt something strange stirring in his chest, something that had died so long ago that he couldn't even remember its name. Hope. No, it couldn't be. Hope was for the pure, for those who still had the right to enter the synagogue without disapproving glances. Who is the Nazarene? The centurion's voice brought Elijah back. Aratam itinerant prophet, sir. Jesus of Nazareth. They say that he... Elias hesitated. How could he explain to a Roman something he himself didn't completely believe? They say he heals the sick, that his words have power. The silence that followed was as heavy as stone. Elias could hear Marcos's labored breathing in the room, each breath a reminder that time was running out. The centurion stood motionless by the window, watching the ever-growing crowd. Then Lucius Servius turned, and Elijah saw something he would never forget. A Roman officer, trained never to show weakness, with a face marked by sheer vulnerability. "Elijah," he said, and there was pleading in his voice. "You're Jewish. You know these things. This man, does he really have this power?" Elijah opened his mouth, but the words escaped him. What did he know? He had strayed so far from the faith of his fathers, so far from the synagogues and prayers, that he had no right to have an opinion about holy men. I don't know, sir. The rumors... Rumors? The centurion ran a hand over his face. Rumors are all I have now. Marcos's breathing became shallower. Silence tightened around Elias's throat again. He looked at the boy on the mat, so young, so full of life even in the morning, now slipping away to some dark and distant place. He thought of all the times Marcos had laughed at his bad jokes, shared bread with him when loneliness became too much. "Lord," Elijah heard himself say, almost surprised by his own voice, "if there's a chance, however small—" The centurion turned sharply. His eyes met Elijah's, and there, in that moment, there was no Roman and Jew, no master and servant, only two desperate men facing the abyss. "Go," Lucius ordered, but it was more of a plea than a command. "Find this Nazarene, ask him to come, tell him that—" He paused, his voice faltering. "Tell him that a man is begging for mercy." Elijah felt his heart race. Go to a Jewish prophet? He, the impure one, the collaborator, the rejected one, approach a holy man when his own family considered him dead. But then he looked at Marcos again, saw his chest rising and falling in painful effort, and something greater than his fear spoke within him. "Yes, sir," said Elijah, and his voice came out firm. "I will go." He crossed the house in quick steps, his heart pounding in rhythm with his feet against the mosaic. Outside, the sun was already high, turning Capernaum into a furnace. The crowd was even larger now, a river of humanity flowing toward the central square. Elias plunged into that current of people, pushing when necessary, dodging when possible. Sweat ran down his back, the sun burned his bare head, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop, because for the first time in 7 years, Elias ben Azarias had a purpose that went beyond serving and surviving. He was running towards something he didn't understand, searching for a man he had never seen, carrying an impossible request from a Roman centurion for a servant on the verge of his final journey. And somewhere deep within his wounded chest, in that part he had sworn was dead, something began to awaken. Not hope yet, perhaps only the distant memory of what hope once was. The crowd was a living organism that breathed, sweated and pushed. Elias felt elbows digging into his ribs, shoulders bumping against his, the strong smell of unwashed bodies mixed with the perfume of spices some rich woman wore. His sandals slipped on the dust kicked up by hundreds of feet, and his throat burned from breathing in that hot, heavy air. "Please," he murmured, trying to make his way through. "I need to get through, it's urgent." But no one was listening, or if they were, they didn't care. Each person there had their own urgency, their own wound, their own impossible quest. An elderly woman wept softly, holding a cloth that smelled of medicinal herbs. A middle-aged man carried a little girl in his arms, her face marked by scars that Elias chose not to examine. Everyone wanted to reach him, to reach the Nazarene. Elias forced his way between two fishermen who were arguing loudly about a miracle they had witnessed days before. "I saw it with my own eyes," one of them shouted. "The fever left her instantly. Instantly." The other shook his head, somewhere between disbelief and astonishment. Finally, Elijah managed to reach the front of the crowd. The central square of Capernaum opened up before him, a space normally used for the trade of fish and grain, now transformed into something different. There was an eerie silence in the center of all that chaos, like the eye of a storm. And there, under the shade of an ancient fig tree, he saw him. Jesus of Nazareth was simpler than Elijah had expected. There was no golden aura, no purple robes or crown of any kind. Just a man of perhaps his 30s, with dark hair touched by the dust of the road, clothes of common linen stained by the journey, hands calloused from carpentry. He was sitting on a large stone surrounded by a group of men who seemed to be his followers, and was talking to a woman who was weeping at his feet. But there was something Elias couldn't name. The way he looked at that woman, as if he saw not only her face, but every layer of accumulated pain beneath. His voice, when he spoke, had a weight that didn't match its low volume. "Your faith has set you free. Go in peace." The woman stood up, her face transformed, and the crowd erupted in murmurs. Elijah felt his heart pound. He needed to approach. He needed to speak. But how? How could an unclean servant, a collaborator of the Romans, dare to interrupt a Jewish prophet? His feet seemed stuck to the ground. It was then that one of Jesus' followers looked in his direction, a large man, broad-shouldered, with hands that betrayed years of hard work. He frowned, recognizing something in Elijah, and nudged his companion beside him. Murmurs began. "Isn't that the one who serves the centurion? What does he want here? A traitor daring to approach." Elias felt the blood run cold in his veins. The old shame rose in his throat like bile. He took a step back, ready to give up, to run back to the Roman house and tell the centurion that he had tried, that it was impossible, that men like him had no right to ask anything of holy men. But then he remembered Marcos's face, the waxy pallor, the failing breath, the centurion on his knees. Elias clenched his fists and took a step forward. "Master!" His voice came out louder than he intended, breaking the murmur of the crowd. Everyone turned, dozens of eyes, hundreds perhaps, fixed on him, judging, weighing, condemning. But Jesus simply looked, and that look was like cold water on a furnace day. There was no judgment there was no contempt, just complete, total attention, as if at that moment Elias was the only person in the world who mattered. "Speak," said Jesus, and his voice was gentle. Elias felt his legs tremble. The words he had mentally rehearsed throughout the race slipped through his fingers like sand. I serve the centurion Lucius Servius," he began, and heard the indignant murmurs around him. But Jesus raised a hand, and silence fell like a cloak. "There is a young servant," Elias continued, his voice breaking. "Mark, he is on the verge of his final journey. The doctors said there is nothing to be done. My lord, the centurion." He paused, not knowing how to continue. How could he ask this? How could a pagan Roman expect mercy from a Jewish prophet? But Jesus leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Elijah. "And the centurion sent you?" "Yes, master. Elias swallowed hard, feeling unwanted tears burning his eyes. "He loves the boy like a son. He's desperate. I know we don't have the right to ask. I know that he is a Gentile, and I am—" The word unclean stuck in his throat. "Where is the boy?" Jesus' question was direct and practical. "At the centurion's house, sir, on the upper part of the city." Elijah looked around, mentally gauging the distance. A brisk 15-minute walk, perhaps more with the crowd. Jesus rose from the stone, shaking the dust from his garments. "Then let's go," he said simply. The statement struck Elias like a thunderbolt. He would go, just like that, without hesitation? A Jewish prophet entering the house of a Roman centurion? The ritual impurity that this represented, the breaking of all rules? "Master, no," Elijah heard himself say, and the words came out in a desperate torrent. "You don't need to come. My master, the centurion, he told me to tell you something." Jesus stopped, waiting. Elias took a deep breath, remembering the exact words Lucius Servius had spoken to him as he rushed through the door. Words that at the time seemed strange, coming from a Roman soldier, but which now made a profound and terrifying sense. "My master said, 'I am not worthy to have you come under my roof.'" Elijah's voice trembled, but he continued. "He said, I too am a man under authority. I have soldiers under me, and I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes. I understand authority, Master. That is why my master said—" Elijah paused, the weight of those words almost impossible to bear. "Just say the word, and my servant will be healed." The silence that fell over the square was absolute. There were no more murmurs, no more movement. It was as if time itself had stopped to witness that moment. Jesus stood completely still. His eyes, which had been gentle, now burned with something Elijah couldn't name. Awe? Joy? Something greater than both? Then the Nazarene turned slowly to the crowd, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made the air vibrate. "Truly I tell you," his words echoed through the square, "I have not found such great faith, even in Israel." Elias felt his legs weaken. Faith was a Roman soldier's understanding of authority faith. Jesus turned to him again, and there was a smile on his face, a smile that carried centuries of hope, that recognized something precious and rare amidst all the cynicism of the world. "Go," said Jesus, and his voice was firm as a stone, gentle as a breeze, "and let it be done according to your faith." Elias expected something more, a dramatic gesture, words in ancient Aramaic, a lightning bolt from the sky. But none of that happened. Just those simple words, spoken with a certainty that could move mountains. And then Elijah felt it. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a sight. It was something that swept through his chest like a wave, warm and liquid and impossible to describe. It was as if the air had changed density, as if something invisible but absolutely real had moved through space, starting from that simple man under the fig tree and traveling through the streets of Capernaum toward the Roman house in the upper part of the city. Elias staggered. His knees buckled and he fell onto the dust of the square, his hands touching the hot earth. Tears streamed down his face unbidden, wetting the dry ground. He didn't know why he was crying. He didn't know if it was fear, relief, or that dead thing in his chest that was suddenly beginning to beat again. "Get up!" Jesus' voice was closer now. Elijah felt a hand on his shoulder, calloused and firm. "Go in peace." Elijah looked up and met that gaze again. And there, in the eyes of Jesus of Nazareth, he saw something he hadn't seen in 7 years. He saw acceptance. He saw worth. He saw that perhaps, just perhaps, men like him were not lost beyond redemption. "Master," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Go," Jesus repeated gently. "Your journey is not over." Elias stood up, his legs trembling, his heart pounding like a war drum. He turned and began to run. He ran as he had never run before, his feet pounding on the hot stone, sweat pouring down, his lungs burning. The crowd parted before him, and he sped through that sea of people as if it were sand. The streets of Capernaum passed by in a blur. The marketplace, the fountain, the white stone houses reflecting the merciless sun. His heart wasn't just beating from physical exertion. It was beating with something more, something whose name he had forgotten, but which now hammered in his chest with a force impossible to ignore. Hope. The Roman house loomed before him, its white columns gleaming against the deep blue sky. Elias climbed the steps in 2 leaps, crossed the atrium, his feet slipping on the polished mosaic. "Sir," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls, "Sir!" And then he saw. Centurion Lucius Servius stood in the corridor, his face transformed, and in his arms, leaning but standing, was Marcus. The boy was still pale, still weak, but his eyes were open. His eyes were alive. "Elijah," the centurion's voice trembled. He woke up. Suddenly he just woke up. The fever left. The life force began to flow again. It's as if— "I know," Elias interrupted, tears returning in full force. "I know exactly when it happened. And there, in that Roman house in the middle of Capernaum, 3 men wept together, a Gentile centurion, a healed servant, and a messenger who had left skeptical and returned transformed." Fact 3, the legacy and the message. Afternoon fell over Capernaum with that golden light that transformed even the most ordinary stones into something beautiful. Elias sat in the inner courtyard of the Roman house, watching the shadows stretch across the white columns. His hands still trembled slightly, not from fear but from that residual adrenaline that refuses to leave the body after the impossible happens. Marcos lay on cool pillows, drinking chicken broth that one of the cooks had prepared. Color was returning to his face, and although he was too weak to stand for long, his eyes shone with the intensity of someone who had just touched the other side of existence and returned to tell the tale. "I saw something," Marcos murmured, his voice still hoarse. "When it was dark, I saw a light, and then I heard a voice I'd never heard before, but somehow I recognized. It said, 'Get up,' and I got up." Centurion Lucius Servius was kneeling beside the boy, a position no Roman soldier should assume before a servant, but which now seemed the only appropriate one. His large hands held Marcus's thin hand, and there were dried tears on his face that he hadn't bothered to wipe away. "I don't understand," said the centurion, looking at Elijah. His eyes, trained to assess battle tactics and troop movements, were now lost before something that didn't fit into military strategy. "How is this possible? He didn't even come. He didn't even touch the boy. How can words heal?" Elias took a deep breath. He didn't fully understand either, but something inside him had shifted in the central square of Capernaum, something that went beyond logic, beyond reason. "Lord," he began slowly, choosing each word carefully, "the Master didn't need to come because you understood something that few understand." "What?" Lucius leaned forward, eager to understand. "Authority." Elias felt the words emanating from somewhere deep within, as if someone were speaking through him. "You understand that a man with true authority doesn't need to be physically present for his orders to be carried out. When you order a soldier to go, he goes. When you order him to come, he comes, not because you are physically there to force him, but because your word carries weight, carries power." The centurion nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "Jesus of Nazareth," Elias continued, and felt something strange as he pronounced that name with reverence, "has authority over things that go beyond soldiers and battles. He has authority over the very fabric of creation, over sickness, over the fluid of life, over death. And when he speaks, even these forces obey." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Marcos had closed his eyes, but a peaceful smile touched his lips. The centurion looked at his own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. "I conquered cities," Lucius murmured. "I commanded legions. I received decorations from Caesar himself. But today," his voice broke, "today, a Jewish carpenter showed me that I understand nothing about true power." Elijah stood up and walked to the edge of the courtyard, from where he could see the city stretching down the hillside. The first lights of the lamps were beginning to flicker in the windows. The ordinary life of Capernaum continued, oblivious to the miracle that had happened in that house. Fishermen returning with their nets, women preparing dinner, children running through the narrow streets before nightfall. But for Elijah, nothing would ever be ordinary again. He thought of the desperate rush through the crowd, of the moment he first saw Jesus, in those eyes that did not judge, that did not weigh his flaws, that simply saw. He saw what he was like, yes, but also what he could be like, what perhaps he should always have been like. "I spent 7 years carrying shame," Elias said aloud without turning around. 7 years believing that there were choices that place us beyond redemption, that there are places so dark that no light can reach them. He heard the centurion move behind him, but he didn't look. "My family rejected me," Elias continued, his voice firm despite the pain each word carried. "My people consider me unclean. I serve Gentiles, as in homes where devout Jews wouldn't enter even under threat. I convinced myself that holy men like Jesus of Nazareth wouldn't have time for someone like me, that I had made choices that placed me beyond the reach of grace." He turned then, facing the centurion. "But today I learned something, sir. I learned that grace doesn't ask permission to reach out. It simply reaches out. Jesus didn't ask about my history. He didn't demand that I prove my purity. He simply looked at me and saw something worth seeing." Tears streamed freely down Elijah's face now, but he didn't wipe them away. There was no shame in them anymore. They were tears of relief, of liberation, of a weight finally lifted from shoulders too tired to carry it. "And more than that," Elias continued, his voice gaining strength, "he honored the faith of a Roman centurion, a Gentile, an invader, a man who should be an enemy of everything he represents. But Jesus saw the man's faith and called it great, greater than any other he had encountered in Israel." Lucius Servius rose slowly, his knees creaking with the movement. He walked over to Elias and stood beside him, gazing at the city as it prepared for nightfall. "I don't understand your gods," the centurion said softly. "I grew up offering sacrifices to Jupiter and Mars. I saw marble temples and golden statues, but never—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I never felt that any god truly saw me. Not as he saw me today through his words, as if every thought of mine, every intention of my heart was open before him, yet I was still accepted." Elias nodded. "That's the mystery, sir. It's not about being good enough. It's about recognizing our need and believing that he can meet it." Night had now fully fallen. The stars began to dot the darkened sky, that infinite mantle that covered the just and the unjust, Jews and Gentiles, the pure and the impure with the same generosity. Elijah looked up and felt something he hadn't felt since childhood: belonging, as if the universe were no longer a hostile and indifferent place, but a home where he had a right to be. In the days that followed, the story of the centurion and his servant spread through Capernaum like wildfire, but the version people told differed from the reality Elijah had experienced. Some said Jesus had personally gone to the Roman house. Others swore the centurion had converted to Judaism on the spot. The stories grew, changed, and adapted to fit the expectations of those telling them. But Elijah kept the truth in his heart, the simple and powerful truth. A man had spoken a word and death had retreated. A look had been given, and years of shame had begun to dissolve. An unlikely faith had been honored, and boundaries that seemed insurmountable had been, at least for a moment, erased. He returned to the synagogue for the first time in 7 years on a Saturday afternoon. His feet hesitated at the door, and the old fear tightened its grip on his chest again. But then he remembered Jesus' eyes, the smile that said, "You have value, you have a place, you have a purpose." The looks on the faces of those present were harsh, as expected. The baker turned his face away. The elders frowned, but Elijah did not run. He stood at the back, listening to the scriptures being read, and when he heard the words of the prophet Isaiah about the suffering servant who would bear the pains of many, who would be wounded for the transgressions of others, he felt tears burning his eyes again. Because he understood now. He understood that the promised Messiah would not come riding a war horse, surrounded by glittering armies. He would come as Jesus had come, simple, accessible, touching the untouchable, honoring the dishonored, seeing the invisible. After the service, an elderly man approached him. It was Reuben, who had been a friend of his father. His eyes were moist. "We heard about what happened," he said softly. "About the centurion. About you." Elias waited for condemnation, but it did not come. "So your father," Reuben continued, his voice trembling, "is ill, very ill. He asked about you yesterday. He said your name." The world stopped spinning. Elias felt his knees weaken. "My father, he wants to see you before—" Reuben didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Elias ran. He ran as he had run toward Jesus, but this time toward the past he had thought dead and buried. His father's house was small, humble, smelling of sawdust and old wood. He pushed open the door with trembling hands. The old carpenter lay on mats, his face marked by time and disease. But when his eyes met Elias's, something shone in them. Recognition, and something more. Something Elias needed a moment to identify. Repentance. "Son," the old man's voice came out hoarse, broken. "I heard about the miracle, about the Nazarene, and I understood." He coughed, his whole body trembling with the effort. "I understood that I was wrong. That rigidity is not holiness. That judgment is not justice." Elias fell to his knees beside his father, his hands clutching those calloused hands that had taught him to work wood as a boy. "Father," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Forgive me," the old man said, tears streaming down his wrinkled face. "Forgive me for rejecting you, for choosing pride over love." And there in that humble house smelling of wood and the past, another miracle happened. Not as dramatic as Marcus's instant healing, but equally powerful. The miracle of reconciliation, the miracle of bridges being rebuilt over abysses that seemed insurmountable. Elias embraced his father, feeling the frail bones beneath his hands, and wept. He wept for the pain of the lost years. He wept for the joy of their reunion. He wept because Jesus' words that morning had not only healed a Roman servant, but had begun a wave of restoration that continued to expand. His father did not recover from the illness. 3 days later, he gave up his spirit peacefully, with Elijah holding his hand. But he died reconciled. He died in peace, and that made all the difference. At the funeral, Elias spoke. He spoke about faith and forgiveness, about how love is stronger than tradition, about how a carpenter from Nazareth was showing them a different way of living, a way where mercy triumphed over judgment. Some listened, others turned their faces away, but seeds had been planted. Months later, Elias was still serving in the Centurion's house, but now it was different. It was no longer just about survival. It was about purpose. He had become a bridge between two worlds, helping Lucius Servius understand Jewish customs, teaching Mark about the faith that had secured his healing. And every time he crossed the central square of Capernaum, Elijah looked at the fig tree where Jesus had sat that day. The tree was still there, indifferent to the miracle he had witnessed. But for Elijah, it was a memorial, a reminder that none of us are beyond the reach of grace. True authority doesn't need brute force, but a simple word spoken with conviction. Faith is not about being perfect, but about recognizing our need and trusting in the one who can meet it. And sometimes, the greatest transformations don't come from spectacular miracles, but from a gaze that sees us as we truly are, and still declares, "You have value." Elias ben Azarias never became a famous disciple. His name is not recorded in the annals of history, but he lived the rest of his days knowing a truth that many never discover, that the kingdom of God does not belong to the perfect, but to those who recognize their need for it. And when Jesus of Nazareth speaks a word, heaven and earth move to fulfill it.